Hello, hello. As y'all are joining, let's open some wine. I think we're just going to have a nice chill chat today, drinking the 2019 Petite Sirah from Lost Draw Cellars. This is Veraison Hills. Hi, everyone. Tell me how your holiday was. I'd love to hear about your weekend. What exciting things that y'all drank this weekend. I'd really like to know what your favorite food and wine pairing was this weekend. And we are going to have a talk today about everything that we've learned in the past 12 weeks together. Well, 11 weeks together. We're going to synthesize it all with this wonderful wine in front of us. For those of y'all just joining, this is what we're drinking. For those of y'all that are watching recorded, I'm so happy to have spent all this time with you. Thank you for taking the time to watch these back and learn a little bit about Texas wine. Say hi to me in the comments, guys. I want to know that y'all are there going to ask questions today to help spur on our discussion. Today's discussion, this wine from beginning to end. But let's get something in the glass. If you do not have this Petite Sirah, something that might be similar is something like a Tannat. A Syrah might be a tad similar, something like a Sagrantino. A really bold, juicy red wine that has a good amount of fruitiness and a good amount of chocolatiness as well. Oh, that smells amazing. I am going to decant my wine today, and I recommend that y'all do as well. But if you've never tasted this wine before, go ahead and taste a little bit of it undecanted, and then decant it and then taste it again just to see how the wine changes. I always recommend that, but I drink this wine all the time, so I know exactly what it tastes like undecanted. So I did a quick, simple decant, pour it in a decanter, then straight into the glass afterwards. Y'all can let this sit for longer, but I like for my wine to open up in the glass, and that's what I'm going to let it do as we talk for the next 45 minutes or so. And for those of y'all just joining, I'm going to check in the comments to say hi to y'all, but go ahead and open this wine that you see on the screen. Hi, Tracy, Raquel, Julie, and John in Houston, Catherine, San Antonio, Michelle, and Ray. Hi, everyone. Beautiful color. Yes, we already have a comment on the gorgeous color of this wine, something that Petite Sirah is known for. Just gorgeous. I love when people are looking at the color of wine. Well done, Raquel. I often see people, especially when I'm pouring a tasting for someone, I see them jump directly from pouring the wine in the glass to smelling and tasting it without taking the time to just appreciate that purple color that just has such a deep core and reaches out all the way to the outside. Get a look at that nose. I want this wine to open up. I know it will. It's balled up in a really tight ball, which is why I recommend decanting it. If y'all want to let this wine sit in a decanter for a while, I'm totally open for y'all doing that. But let's start chatting about this wine. All right, so today we're talking about this wine from beginning to end. And what that means is we are going to synthesize everything that we've learned over the last 11 weeks, hopefully, with this wine in front of us so that we can take the journey from before the grapes were ever in ground, all the way to us opening the bottle and pouring it in the glass. Now, we've talked about concepts during this entire fall semester wine school that range from the flavor of the wine and how the flavor gets there. You know, if you have a grape in a glass, but you're tasting and smelling blueberry and basil and dried herbs and granite and minerality, how is that possible? We've talked about things like food pairing. So this is after the wine has already been made and you've opened the wine. Then what do you do with it? How do you pair it? How do you decant it? How does oxygen interact with it? We've talked a bit about winemaking and winemaking choices and how that can influence the flavor of a wine. It can also influence more than that. It can influence the balance of the wine. And we did take a couple sessions to talk about how a wine comes into balance before it's ever even been opened. How do we get that balance in the bottle? And a lot of that is in the vineyard, and a lot of that is in the winemaking as well. And we talked mostly about the time in the vineyard. And this is what we believe at Lost Draw and William Chris. We believe that wine is grown, not made. And everything we do is just trying not to undo the beautiful work that was done in the vineyard. And we're going to start today before the wine was ever planted. So before the vines are planted, what was Petite Sirah and why was Petite Sirah Petite Sirah? That is where we're going to start. But why don't we take a sip of this wine first and talk about what y'all are tasting. Hi, Ledbetters. Good to see y'all on here. So this wine I mentioned is really tight. I expect it's going to open up a little bit in the glass as we talk. And even after we sign off, I'm sure it's going to continue opening up. What I mean by tight right now is I can tell this wine is juicy and has a big personality, but the aromas aren't coming to me immediately. I'm having to really search for them right now. I know they're in there because when I smell this wine, it smells like velvet. It smells like a texture to me, but I can't put my finger on what that is. I think I'm getting dark fruit characters like plum, even prune. It's a dried fruit character. What are y'all noticing in this glass? I want to know. Stick your noses in. Tell me what you're getting. There's definitely a minerality here, isn't there? It's stony, steely. It's dark, flinty almost. And then chocolate. There's so much chocolate in this wine. And I expect if I double decanted this, if I poured it back in the decanter and back in the glass, it would come out more. I expect that to come out more as the wine is sitting here. But I can tell it's going to be big, and it has kind of a sweet, unctuous tone to it that makes me want to taste it. Oh, this is a big wine. It's big, it has weight to it, but it's really smooth. It's velvety. It's just like it smells. It has a velvety, sultriness to it. Kind of mysterious. And then there's a tart kiss in the background. And I get that a lot off of Lost Draw Cellars wines. Lost Draw wines can be really acid driven, meaning that in the balance of the entire wine, we may not have a high acid wine, but there's a tartness that rings through, and that tartness lifts up the wine. It also makes it pretty food friendly. So I think this would be lovely with a piece of food, like a fatty meat or something, or a cheese. But if you want to drink this by itself, decanting is the way to get that tartness to balance out into the rest of the wine. It'll still be there. The acidity will still be there, lifting the wine and making it vibrant, but it'll help it remain smooth from beginning to end. Oh gosh. What a wonderful wine. And I can't wait to decant this. I'm going to double decant this now because I really want this wine to start singing earlier. I'm really excited to drink this one. All right, so let's talk about what Petite Sirah is. So we talked about grapes. There are many, many grape varieties out there. And what we've talked about with grape varieties so far is that all grape varieties have a set of characteristics that they're associated with. You wouldn't expect two totally different grape varieties to have the same set of characteristics. Sure, there can be similarities between grape varieties, but each one of them was cultivated for a different reason. And a couple of those reasons could be the color of the skins, the fact that, some grapes are green grapes and some grapes are black grapes that have a certain amount of pigment in them. This is a highly pigmented grape. Another set of characteristics could be flavor characteristics. So Petite Sirah is associated with chocolate and coffee notes, stony notes, and then dark dried berry fruit notes. It's also associated with racking up quite a bit of sugar. It needs a quite warm climate to ripen fully. And in a warm climate, it ends up racking up a lot of sugar, which is then translated to alcohol if you're making a dry wine, which this is. Hi, Mona. How are you? We are drinking this wine today. So go ahead and open it up. Another set of characteristics that is often forgotten with talking about grape varieties, because we talk about the taste, we talk about the taste so much because it's wonderful. We talk about the color, the tannin content, the acid, but we fail to talk about disease resistance. And that is why Petite Sirah was created. So in the 1800s, Petite Sirah was created by a man named Dr. Francois Durif. And he named this grape after himself. He named it Durif, which was not the sexiest name for a grape. It was renamed Petite Sirah when it came over to California in the late 1800s. But this guy, Dr. Durif, was trying to create a version of the Syrah grape that was resistant to powdery mildew, which is a disease that is treacherous in places like the Rhone Valley. So he succeeded. He created a grape that was resistant to powdery mildew, that had some Syrah characteristics, but had much smaller berries, which is why Petite Sirah is called Petite Sirah. This is not a small wine, it's just small berries. So he created this grape resistant to powdery mildew. Unfortunately, the clusters of the grapes were very, very tight together, meaning that the Rhone Valley was not suitable for growing this grape. Therefore, it found its way over to California and places like Australia, where there was a warm climate, but there was a little bit more airflow, air circulation that could help push away other diseases that these tight clusters would be susceptible to. So that's how Petite Sirah came to be. It was cultivated and continued to be grown for its disease resistance. And we reap the benefits of the fact that they're small berries. These small berries affect the final taste of the wine. A grape with small berries will have a higher skin to juice ratio, meaning that inside the grape you have a certain amount of water, sugar, and acids building up. The skin of the grape will have the color, the tannin, and more flavors. So in a wine that's made from small berries, you will have more of that tannin, color, and flavor, and less of the water, sugar, and acid that's inside of the grape. So you end up with a really, really intense, concentrated wine, concentrated in color, tannin, and flavor. And that's what we have in our glass here. You cannot see through the color of this wine, and there is a nice, firm tannin on it. This also means that our flavors are concentrated. So once again, get into your glass, take a sip of this wine, and don't just think about the plum and the coffee in there. Think about how powerful that plum and coffee is. The fact that Petite Sirah exists and was created and created small berries directly affects the way these wines taste. This wine is so rich. It's not just the tannin content. This wine is drying my mouth out. That tannin is really, really getting in over my gums. But there is such a strong, powerful coffee chocolate note and a plum, and it's a dried plum note that is just it's unctuous. There's no other way to say it. Awesome. So that's before we even planted the vines. This is what we were given to start with. Now, when we plant the vine is when we start to see the effect of terroir. Terroir, we discussed last week or the week before. Terroir is the culmination of flavors that are created from climate, airflow, sun. It is tradition, how we grow grapes here in Texas. Soil. It is a culmination of many things in the environment that will affect how the flavors of Petite Sirah represent themselves in this glass. So let's talk about a couple things that terroir did to this wine to affect how it tastes like a Texas wine and not like a wine from anywhere else. So first of all, the soil that we're planting in here is a deep sandy soil. And this is in San Saba County in a vineyard called Veraison Hills. So Veraison Hills was planted in 2015 by Mike and Diana Dickey. Sorry. They planted this vineyard over deep sandy soil that's very well drained. And this was smart because that well drained soil means that the moisture that's in the air is going to have an outlet. It won't cluster around the grapes. It'll continue to push down into the soil so that the roots have to grow quite deep in order to reach water in the soil. This is also where they're going to find their nutrients. Now, when we talked about terroir, we talked about many different things. Deep roots can mean a lot of different things. First of all, deep roots are in search of nutrients that grapes need to survive. And grapes don't need that many nutrients in order to survive. They only need 5 major nutrients and then a smattering of others. They find this in the soil and by also passing nutrients from everything else that's growing in that area. And if we look at what else is growing in that area, we're talking oak trees, cedar trees, mesquite trees, lots of tall grasses. We're talking cactus, and we're talking things like pecan trees. This means that you might find a representation of some of those flavors in this glass as well. What grows together will end up imparting some form of personality into the glass as well. Since we're in the Texas Hill Country, we also find a decent amount of limestone in the soil. So it's not just what's growing around there, it's what else is in the soil. We have quite mineral soil around there. Remember, San Saba County is right above Burnett, which is where we find the Llano Uplift. This is high mineral content area that's a result of ancient magmic eruption. We have some really, really solidified gems in the soil that will impact the minerality of this wine directly. Limestone can cause the acidity to increase or seem higher in a wine, can also boost the aromatics of the final wine. And sand itself can make a wine have finesse. So even though we're looking at a grape that is very intense and can be very structured, very, very bold and impactful, we're planting it in soil in an area that can cause for more aromatics and more elegance. So now go back to this glass and find that elegance. If these grapes were planted in another soil that didn't have that limestone and sand personality, we might expect a more bold punch, something that hits us in the face instead of wraps around us. And I find that this wine wraps around me like velvet. And I said it before, this wine is just velvety. So this wine is coming out. The aromatics are really, really pushing out of the glass. And I think that's quite unique for Petite Sirah. It's pretty, isn't it? There's a bubblegummy note that's popping out of here. It's sweet and fresh like flowers, but not like violet. It's like rose. Rose just kind of wafts out towards you, doesn't it? And this wine is woody. This wine has a lot of dried herb in it, like a rosemary note. That type of delicacy doesn't happen when wines are too bold and impactful. Bold, impactful wines can be so fruity that it covers up any of that undertone that's like sultry ash and smoke and rosemary. The coffee and chocolate is bold, but it's not overpowering these finer notes of rose and rosemary. And that type of elegance is what I'm talking about. These sandy soils that we have all over Texas, this limestone we have all over Texas, these old soils, these well-drained soils are the terroir impacting this wine. So not only do we have this grape that was created to be disease resistant and had small berries, meaning concentrated tannin and flavor, we've planted these grapes now in a soil that can express elegance. And now we're really starting to build something unique. But it doesn't just end there, of course. So we're in Texas. We have a lot of warmth. We have a lot of sunlight. These grapes are raised up to the sun. They're growing at over 1,000 feet elevation. So we have grapes lifted up to the sun. More sun exposure will build up more sugar in the grapes. And with the heat that we have in Texas, we can expect these grapes to ripen pretty quickly. The grapes are harvested in 2019. They were harvested in as late as October. It's pretty late for us. So these grapes hung on the vine for quite a while. Now, the danger with Petite Sirah is that the sugar will increase. And as the sugar is increasing, the acidity will drop pretty low. So the choice that we have to make in Texas is to harvest these grapes when the acidity hasn't fallen too low. Now, if we're planting on limestone, we can expect some of the acidity to be preserved or be a little bit pointier. And this is an acid-driven wine. There's that tart note that's helping lift the wine. That is partly from terroir, and I guess partly from the wine growers like Brad Buckaloo and Andrew Sides and Chris Brendrett going out into the vineyard and testing these grapes to make sure they're bringing in the grapes when the acidity hasn't fallen too low. The danger with the acidity falling too low in this wine is that you'll end up with a flabby wine. We talked about flabby a couple weeks ago. Flabby means you have all of this wonderful stuff, fruitiness, bubblegum, rose, rosemary, but there's nothing lifting that up. And so it all just falls flat and it ends up being cloying. That cloying aroma and taste of a wine that just kind of sits on your tongue and has wonderful flavor, but just ends up being sticky. That is not what we have here. We have a wine here that has vibrant acidity because we made the choice to harvest it when it hadn't built up so much sugar that the acidity dropped too low. Now, if you remember, we talked about perception versus precision one week. This was a while ago when I was in Houston. Precision is about telling what the exact acidity of this wine is. Now, we can taste the acid in this wine on the finish. That doesn't mean this wine has high acidity. You can tell where the acidity is of this wine by allowing it to sit on the sides of your tongue for a second, swallowing, and then opening your mouth, sticking your tongue out, and waiting to see how long your mouth waters for. So I'm going to do that exercise now so that we can accurately tell what the acidity of this wine is. This wine has just medium acidity. Even though it's a tart wine, the balance of the wine is telling us it's tart, but the acidity is not high any longer. Petite Sirah can have high acidity, but because of the warmth in Texas, the sugar has built up to the point that the acidity dropped down to medium, and then we made sure to harvest those grapes there so that the acidity wouldn't drop any lower. This is part of the terroir of Texas. This is reaching balance in the final wine by harvesting the grapes when they are ready to be harvested. Because we harvested these grapes early enough to preserve acidity, the alcohol only ended up being 13.1% in this wine. That is a medium alcohol. We certainly could have allowed these grapes to ripen longer and increase in alcohol. But if you end up with a 14.5% alcohol Petite Sirah in Texas, you're likely going to have low acidity and ultimately an unbalanced wine. So part of the terroir of this wine is the choice of when to harvest the grapes when they were ready in Texas. I have a couple comments. I want to make sure. Hi, Coco. I'm sorry I missed your comment earlier. We are drinking a Petite Sirah from Veraison Hills Vineyard, and this is a Lost Draw Cellars wine. Julie, that's a good question. Is there any special trellising used? So for those who don't know, trellising is when you train a grapevine into a desired shape. There are many desired shapes depending on where you are and what you're trying to achieve with the grapes. But a grapevine will climb up a tree and try and reach as close to the sun as possible if left untrellised. So it's a climbing vine. When we trellis a vine in Texas, we're typically using the same type of trellising. And this is to train one trunk upward and then to train two what's called cordons. They're kind of thick wood that is trained outward in order to allow clusters of grapes to grow underneath. So a vine will be trained like this. You'll see leaves and shoots trained upward, and then the grapes will fall below. The reason that we use this in Texas is because those leaves and shoots will provide shade to the grapes underneath so that no sun burning happens. And so the grapes are pretty easy to get at when they're ready to harvest, either by machine or by hand. And we've harvested by machine at Veraison Hills. So this is particularly desired with Petite Sirah because those tight clusters of grapes mean that adequate airflow is really, really crucial so that mold doesn't develop. So by training the leaves and shoots upward, we're shielding the grapes from the sun, but we're also allowing any wind that blows through to blow through and blow away disease pressure from these tight clusters. Getting mold in the center of any of those clusters means that you have to trash those grapes. You cannot make wine with that type of mold. Actually, that's not true. You can, but that is not a common practice that we're using for red wines. So we're calling that trellising vertical shoot positioning, or VSP. And that's the most common vine training that's used in Texas because of the sun and because of that air circulation that we're trying to promote. So what has all of our choices in the vineyard yielded for us? First of all, a high amount of warmth and sun means that we're getting ripe fruit characters out of this wine. The other thing that it means is that, yes, we'll build up a lot of sugar and we'll get dried, stewed fruit characters. But in order to preserve the acidity, we're harvesting a little bit earlier than we might normally in another place. Everyone smell and taste that, that ripe black plum, that dried prune character. That is terroir being expressed through our sun and our warmth in Texas. Sorry, I'm checking my notes to make sure I hit all the points I wanted to. Yes, so harvesting a little bit earlier than you might somewhere else is preserving the acidity. The other thing that it's preserving is all of those really delicate, elegant flavors in here. That dried rosemary, that rose, these subtle cedar notes, all of these can be covered by intense fruitiness. And harvesting our grapes while the acidity is still vibrant and when the sugar hasn't built up too much, it means that we're also saving the wine from becoming overly fruity and covering any of that elegance and delicacy. So what we end up with is a really true to Texas wine that was grown at Veraison Hills in deep, well-drained soil that has caused a wine to have such elegance and represent itself elegantly in the final glass. If you've ever had a Petite Sirah before, you know how bold and dry and intense these wines can get. So to get a wine that is balanced between elegance and boldness is really, really something special and something to be prized. And I like to think is the reason why we're all sitting here drinking Texas wine and celebrating the fact that we can make something as cool as this, not just cool, but ageable, food friendly, and just rewarding. And now we've only gotten halfway through the process. We've talked about where Petite Sirah came from, why it was created. We've talked about planting it in Texas soil and what that can cause. And that's just one place in Texas that we've talked about. Imagine if this Petite Sirah was planted elsewhere on a different type of soil with a different amount of airflow at a different elevation with a slightly cooler temperature and windier area. Who knows the range of what we can create in Texas with just one single grape. All right, so we've gone over harvest choices, which means we can talk about how the winemaking influenced this wine. So we've created this exceptional fruit at this beautiful vineyard in the Texas Hill Country. Then what? Well, first, we try not to mess that up. There are a lot of things that winemakers can do to manipulate a wine. They can add color to a wine. They can add sugar. They can add acid. They can manipulate the wine. They can filter it. They can put it in oak barrels. They can put it in stainless steel. They can put it in concrete. They can put it in a clay vessel and bury it underground for a long time. The amount of time that the process takes will change the wine significantly. So our entire effort is to preserve what happened in the vineyard. We have deep sandy soils, we have wonderful circulation, we have intense sunlight. Everything that happened to these grapes while they're growing is something worth preserving. That elegance and boldness that we've managed to wrap together is preserved by several things. So first of all, when we picked these grapes, we made sure that they got to fermenting as quickly as possible so that we could capture their freshness. All of those delicate aromas, all of those fruit aromas, they start to change as soon as, oh, I'm sorry, phones are ringing. All of those flavors start to change as soon as the grapes are harvested and brought to the winery. So we ferment them as quickly as possible. And as soon as that fermentation process happens, this is when the flavor compounds in the grapes separate from the sugars turn into alcohol, and all of those other flavors are released. And this is everything that the grape has in signature flavors, those dark berries, those chocolate flavors. That's the signature characters of Petite Sirah, but also all of that unique terroir that they gained from the soil and the nutrients in the soil and pulled up into the grapes as they were growing in the place that they were growing. So all of those are finally released. We're finally able to capture those. And as the process of winemaking goes on, the winemakers are consistently tasting the wine to see what has come out of the ground. Part of their winemaking is determined by using these grapes previously. You know, the amount of times that we've worked with Petite Sirah from Veraison Hills has defined how we treat these grapes. We have found that fermenting these grapes in a large oak fermenter preserves their aromatic intensity and doesn't cover any of those delicate aromas. From there, the grapes went into oak barrels, so smaller oak barrels. Large oak fermenters are much larger. They went into small oak barrels. Only 20% of those barrels were new oak. New oak will impart a little seasoning spice to the wine. This is something that you find commonly around the world with red wines. It has added flavors of coffee and chocolate on top of the coffee and chocolate aromas that Petite Sirah already has. And then other flavors like clove, it can sometimes be vanilla. And then 80% of the barrels were neutral oak barrels. And this is not imparting any flavor to the wine, but it is inviting oxygen into the process. And this method of winemaking is specifically chosen to expand the flavors that were gathered in the vineyard and allow them to play around and express themselves, but also to soften the tannins in the wine. Now, we mentioned that the skin to juice ratio of Petite Sirah is pretty high. There's a lot of skin compared to a small amount of juice because they're very small berries. This means we get a high tannin content. When you have a high tannin content in a grape, to soften those out, oxygen is what you need. Oxygen and tannin is like a hammer to leather. Leather is going to be very, very, very tough, and hammering it out is what softens it. This is exactly what oxygen is doing to the tannins in your wine. It's softening them that. So over 19 months, we slowly softened out the tannins of this wine so that they are a lovely melt away, grainy, soft tannin instead of big, chunky, intense tannins that would dry our mouths out a lot and maybe make this wine unpleasant and even kind of bitter. So that long 19 months softened out these tannins so that they are buttery like they are now. Let's taste. And feel the tannins. If you remember in a previous class, I recommended swishing the wine around your mouth so that you can feel the wine in the entirety of your mouth. Flavor is a big part of wine, yes, but structure is a big part of it as well. And swishing the wine around your mouth means that you're going to get tannin on the top of your teeth and gums, sometimes even on the back of your lip. You're also going to get it on the sides of your tongue, and you're going to allow your mouth to start watering in reaction to the acidity. In this way, you're able to get the full impact of the wine and not only assess what it tastes like, but you're able to assess why it tastes the way it does. So once we can feel the tannins, we can feel that they're intense. There are a lot of tannins, but they're soft and supple. That is large oak fermenter fermentation and barrel aging that has softened out these tannins. The other thing that Brad Buckaloo does is he ferments his wines at a warm temperature. This allows for more tannin and color extraction, which is why we get this beautiful dark color. But the other goal there is to allow the aromas to fully express themselves so that when you pop the cork, the flavors are there, they are matured, they are fully intact, which means we don't need to age this wine in order for it to be supple and ready to drink. This means that we can enjoy this highly sophisticated wine now instead of waiting 20 years. And there are certainly Petite Sirahs out there that do age for 10 to 20 years because they are high in tannin and need to be softened out, and because the flavors aren't quite ready to express themselves. So Brad has done a lot of stuff in the winemaking process to get this wine to fully express itself when we need it to, which is, 4 years, 3 years after it was bottled. That's pretty early for a wine. All right. We're in the end zone of our final conversation because it doesn't just stop there. It doesn't just stop with winemaking. A lot of what we've talked about in these classes has been what happens when we pop the cork and we're finally ready to enjoy it. Because wine is a living thing, it's constantly changing in reaction to oxygen. As soon as we have the wine in our hands, the process is continued, but it is then our power and our choice on how it's going to taste and how it's going to express itself. All right, let me see if y'all had any questions. Ooh, good question, Julie. Okay, Mona asked, how do the clusters typically form? Are they full and plump even though the grapes are smaller? Yes, Mona, that's a really good question. So we've talked about some, I think we talked about some grapes that ripen unevenly, where you get some green berries, where you get some raisinated berries as well. Petite Sirah, from what I know, ripens pretty evenly. So if you look at pictures of Petite Sirah on the internet, you'll find a really tightly formed kind of cone-shaped cluster of vines grapes that are all fully ripe and deeply colored. When you want to grow Petite Sirah, you're in for a long process because the grapes need a lot of warmth and a lot of time to ripen fully. The warmer the climate is, the faster they're going to ripen, which makes Texas well suited for Petite Sirah. But the grapes will, by the end, pretty much all be fully ripened, plump. They build up a lot of sugar, but they're small berries that impart more tannin and color. I hope that answered your question. And Julie, what makes a barrel neutral? Yes, well used is the answer. So in the first 3 years, the barrel will impart the majority of its flavor. In the first year, it imparts the vast majority of the flavor. So after 2 or 3 uses, the barrel starts to become more and more neutral. And after the third use, the barrel pretty much doesn't impart any flavor any longer. A neutral barrel means that oxygen is still getting to the wine through the pores in the oak, but that flavor isn't becoming a part of the process. So this can be similar to concrete aging as well. Oxygen is part of the process, but flavor is not part of the process. Very different than stainless steel aging. Stainless steel is not a porous vessel. So when you're aging in stainless steel, you don't have an oxygen or flavor a part of the process. So there are several different choices that we can use. For red wine, oak barrels, especially new oak barrels, do complement the flavors of many red wines pretty well. Petite Sirah being one of those. Along with that, plum and coffee and chocolate, the flavors of vanilla and clove fit right along. So Petite Sirah often goes through new oak aging, sometimes in as high as 100% new oak. We have chosen to do 20% new oak to add a little bit of seasoning spice, but what we really want as a part of the process is oxygen. So neutral barrel aging was a big part of making this wine what it is. It is raw, it expresses what the grape wanted to express. The tannins are soft, and there is a little bit of seasoning to complement the personality of the wine and allow for a big, rich, fully thought out wine. Tracy, how long does it take to ripen? That depends what climate you're in. Most grapes take 6 to 9 weeks to ripen. Yeah, 6 to 9 weeks. I'd say 2 months is about average. And Petite Sirah in too cool of a climate can take even longer to ripen. But as soon as the temperatures start to cool down in fall, the grape will stop its ripening. Warmth is what's needed to ripen a grape. So where in Texas you have a ton of warmth, it takes a little bit less time to ripen. So less than 2 months, not much less, but a little bit less. Christopher smelled vanilla when he first smelled the wine. Yes, that is the touch of oak influence. And I agree. I got vanilla and I got a lot of warm spices. And I know because it's only 20% new oak that some of that warm spice was from the grape itself and some of it was from the oak. And it has blended in very nicely and complemented the wine really, really well without covering anything. All right, so to our final point. Once we have the wine in hand, the winemaking process has not stopped because we make a portion of this wine. We allow oxygen to interact with the wine as soon as we've popped the cork. So the cork is protecting the wine from oxygen. A cork really doesn't allow oxygen to go through and impact the wine. When a wine is corked, there is a little bit of oxygen that interacts with the wine, but it's just a touch. So as soon as we pop the cork, then oxygen starts to flood in. Once we pour the wine into the glass, tons of oxygen becomes a part of this. When we decant the wine, and when we talked about decanting in week 2, we talked about the way that we decant wine. We can choose how much oxygen gets to the wine by using different size vessels, but also by pouring the wine in different ways. We decide how much oxygen interacts. And the way we do that is by pouring a sample of the wine, smelling and tasting it, and deciding what the wine needs. This means that classes like this can be really helpful because you can start to understand what wine needs by talking to others about what wine is and how you can tell what a wine needs. When I first poured this wine, I said that it was tight, it was closed off. I hope that all of you have realized and understood what I mean now that we're still drinking this wine. It's changed so much over the time that we've spent talking about it. That rose and rosemary, I would not have been able to get out with this wine if I hadn't smelled it when I first opened it and said, this wine is tight, it needs something else, it needs oxygen. I chose to allow oxygen into the wine by decanting it and pouring it into the glass. And even then, I smelled it and tasted it and said, I want more from the wine. When you want that, you introduce more oxygen, either by swirling the wine up a lot or by redecanting it, which I did. I poured it from the glass back into the decanter and then back into the glass. We have the power to make that happen. This wine is only as good as I treat it from here. And this brings up another important topic that we really didn't get to talk much about, and that is temperature. Temperature is a power. We have the power to change the temperature of the wine. Sure, I write tech sheets for this wine. I recommend a service temperature of 59 degrees Fahrenheit because that's a pretty standard cellar temperature. That is cooler than room temperature, but what that allows is for the wine to warm up slightly as it's in the glass. But if we can taste the wine and identify what we want from it and know how temperature impacts that, we then can have the power to make this wine into several different things. And here's an example of how temperature can affect your wine. And I hope that you'll continue reading about this and that when we do this class again in the spring, that we can talk more about this and you'll join me to learn about how temperature can bring out different flavors in your wine. So I've served this wine at room temperature. What I knew I was going to get out of this wine, because I served it at room temperature, was the fruitiness of the wine. And that's one of the first things I said is I smell plum and I smell dried plum. It has a huge impact of fruit. The fruitiness and that chocolate and that cocoa, all of the base notes of this wine came out because it's served at room temperature. But what if I had served it a little bit cooler? What if I had served it at 59 degrees? What if I had put the wine in the fridge for 30 minutes before I opened it? Or what if I had an ice bucket and I just let this wine rest on top for a little bit? If I serve this wine a little bit cooler, what I would expect to smell off of this wine is the rose water, the rosemary, all of those subtle, delicate high notes of the wine. I would be enhancing the more delicate, elegant portion of this wine. And then as you get closer in from cooler and warmer, as you go in between, you'll enhance both of those and you'll have a really playful wine that expresses its fruitiness and its high notes and its chocolate and cocoa at a slightly cool temperature. And this is slightly above room temperature, so maybe 62 degrees. So now that you've drank one glass of this wine, I recommend that you put the wine in the fridge for 20, 30 minutes. Chill it down just a little bit. And I don't want you to chill it down to white wine temperature. I want you to chill it down so that it's a nice, pleasant amount of cool. And I want you to watch as it warms up in the glass, what notes come out. Hopefully you'll notice what I said, or maybe even something more interesting, that you get high notes when you're at a cooler temperature, and that deeper, more sultry notes come out as the wine warms up. And for really any purpose, what I recommend is that you chill your wines down to about 55, 59 degrees Fahrenheit, and that you let the wine warm up as it's in the glass. As you're swirling it, the wine will warm up, and you'll start to notice your wines more progressively. You'll get the high notes at first, and then you'll start to experience the wine opening up, just like you do with oxygen. But in this way, temperature is what's impacting the wine. And we decide what temperature we serve the wine at. Yes, we'll get recommendations from sommeliers, from educators, from winemakers sometimes, but it is never an end-all be-all. There is never a, you must serve this wine at 65 degrees or whatever. You have the choice. You tell us what you want to experience in the wine, and then do it for yourself. There is probably more power in the hands of the person pouring the glass and opening the wine than the winemakers have in their process. Always remember that wine is a living thing, and you know that your wine is no longer changing when you smell it, swirl it, smell it, and taste it again, and the wine has not changed. That means the wine is at the end of its process of change, and you can just sit and enjoy it. But at any other time, if you sip a wine, taste it, and swirl it, taste it again, and it tastes different, your wine will continue to change. And you should pay attention and experience it, because that change is trying to tell you the story of the wine's entire life. And then make sure you're talking about it, because the more you talk about wine, the more you understand and can recognize in the wine. When we silently sip and taste wine, we miss so many things. It's when we talk about it that we really start to get a deeper understanding of it and appreciation of it. All right, let's see if anyone had any more great questions. Julie, good question. So this question is about how the wine is put in barrels when some of them are new and some of them are neutral. So she's asking, is a percentage of the wine put in new oak and then blended with wine aged in neutral barrels? Yes, that is how it works. So with barrels, you have some choices. You can use different oak and mix up the staves of the barrel and the heads of the barrels with different types of oak. But generally, you wouldn't mix up new and neutral oak staves or heads. You're going to make a new barrel and then use it a couple times and it'll become neutral. So when this Petite Sirah was brought in, what the winemakers likely did was say, we have these two new oak barrels over here. The Petite Sirah is really rich. It's expressing itself really well, but it has an elegance to it. I tasted it after fermentation. And it's starting to show these really cool, like herbaceous tones. And I really want to maximize on that. So let's use these 2 new oak barrels to complement the Petite Sirah. And then let's take these other 8 old neutral barrels that aren't going to impart any flavor, so we can make sure that we capture that floral or dried herb character. And then when we're ready to blend it all together, we'll blend it all together and either continue aging it or bottle it immediately. And that's likely how that decision made. At Lost Draw, often we'll blend the wine just prior to bottling, so that when the wine is bottled, it starts to integrate. And over time, you'll notice a better and better, deeper integration of the flavors. And Christopher, thank you for answering that question. You were totally right. Yes, Christopher just synthesized what I said. Catherine asks, how do you determine when to drink a wine? You have a 2013 William Chris Merved. Yes, it's time to drink that. So it's been almost 10 years with that wine. That's probably the maximum amount of time that the wine has. So I think 2023 is the time to drink it. That grape Mourvedre can be pretty ageable. Depending on where that grape was grown, it will either have a lot of elegance or it will have some bold impact. But either way, 10 years is a long time to age a wine, and it's probably at its point where it's reached its peak and it's ready. I recommend drinking that with a cheddar cheese or a Gouda. Some of those cheeses with caramel or nutty notes will really, really complement that. But a cheese will help balance out the acidity that you're going to find in that wine. Oh yeah, we're excited for you. That is going to be stunning. All right, so we've talked about Petite Sirah before it was planted, when it was first invented. We talked about when it was planted in Texas, where it was planted, and how it gained flavor. We talked about the winemaking process of this wine after it was harvested at the perfect time to create the perfect balance. During the winemaking process, we talked about neutral barrel and new barrel and how that influences the flavor, the texture, and the tannin of the wine. And then we finished off by talking about the power that we have as the people opening the wine and pouring a glass for ourselves, changing the flavor that this wine has. Always remember that when you're making choices about decanting a wine or the temperature of a wine, you know that a wine will change with decanting or temperature, and will change depending on how you treat it, because it's a quality wine. A wine that's not a quality wine will not change no matter what you do to it. It will always taste the same. But these wines that are living, these wines that we're making that have personality because we chose the right grape, because we grew it in the right soil, because it has personality from really, really specific terroir, because we don't take anything away from it in the winemaking process, that's what allows us to have choices when we drink the final wine. One thing we didn't talk about is food pairing. So the culmination of this wine from beginning to end, including how we've served it, what we've done to decant it and change the balance of the wine, will decide how we can drink it. So the more you decant it and the longer you decant it, the less it will need food. We're creating a balance without food. But if you open this wine, pour it, and allow it to sit in the glass for maybe 15 minutes while you're cooking, maybe, what you would pair it with is something that pairs well to a tart, bright acidity. And the two things that you're going to want are a bit of sourness, so a squeeze of lemon, something acidic, maybe a cream sauce, and then a little bit of something fatty. So any cream sauce, any amount of cheese, maybe a cut of steak that has some marbling to it. That sour and fat is going to balance this out, just like decanting might. So there are so many options with what we can do with this final wine. And luckily, we've bottled 5 glasses of wine in here, depending on how large of a glass you pour, so that you can experiment with this wine, chill it down, warm it up, decant some of it, pair it with different types of food, so that you can experience the full story that this wine has to offer. And that's the end. That is the end of our discussion. It is not the end of wine education and these sessions. And I'm hoping that I will see y'all. Oh, Tracy, dark chocolate. Absolutely. The chocolate notes in this are going to go lovely. But remember that I said sour and fat is what you want. A milk chocolate might actually go better with this because it has a higher cream content, which means higher fat content and a little bit more acidity. So try a dark milk chocolate or a milk chocolate with this wine. I think you will find it very, very tasty. All right, guys, we do have plans to do these again in 2023. Those of you who are interested in these classes, stay tuned on social media, Facebook, all those places that we post about these classes. Subscribe to our email so that you get notifications about that. And if you subscribe to the texting service for virtual classes, you will be notified first of when there's a new pack coming out in the spring. In the meantime, let me know what y'all want to be talking about, what you want the theme of the classes to be. We will change it up and we'll definitely not talk about the exact same things. Thank you. Thank you all for joining me for so long. Y'all have held on till the very end. And thank you to those who have been watching these recorded. Y'all are very, very special people who want to be talking about Texas wine. And we will continue to spread the word and the love about Texas wine and drinking the best of it, which includes this Petite Sirah, which I think is my favorite wine of the entire course. Anybody else? Oh, I'm going to be sad not to see y'all next week, but I am sometimes on site. If y'all are ever coming out, reach out to me and let me know so that I can try and be there. If y'all ever have any questions, y'all know where to reach me, Kelsey KR at williamchriswines.com. Thanks, guys. Happy New Year and cheers to all your Texas wine drinking. Bye, guys.